I'm Peter Parker from the Melbourne on Transit blog. If you want better public transport in your community, I think these are very exciting times. There's more grounds for optimism now than in recent years. And that goes for many other government services as well, particularly if you live in an area previously considered a safe seat. 30 or 40 years ago, people were much more rusted on in their voting behaviour. In 1985, for instance, less than 1% of Victorian voters voted for an independent or one of the few minor parties contesting seats in that election. 99% of people voted for either Labor, the Liberal or National parties. And most seats were safe. The winner typically got more than 50% of the vote, meaning that the seats result did not depend on preferences from independents or minor parties. As you can see on the graph, there's been a huge change over the last 30 or 40 years. Labor and the coalition parties have their various peaks and troughs, but the trend is clear. The votes for them combined is a smaller percentage of the total voting population. More and more people are voting for minor parties and independents. That means that a lot more seats are dependent on preferences, and there's fewer safe seats than there were. That means that political parties need to work harder in more seats rather than take most of them for granted, as used to be the case. That presents exciting opportunities if you live in a safe seat that didn't previously get a lot of effort by political parties because they took your vote for granted or, alternatively, didn't think they would win your seat. Here's results from the federal seat of Higgins from the May 2022 federal election. This was one of the blue ribbon seats for the Liberal Party. But not in this election. There is enough Greens and minor party vote for the Liberals to lose and the Labor Party candidate to win. Katie Allen, the Liberal candidate, got nearly 41% of the primary vote. But that wasn't enough for that to outweigh the votes from preferences which generally favoured the Labor candidate. Despite the Labor candidate, Michelle Ananda Raja, getting only 28% of the primary vote, that was still enough to put her in second place and for preferences from those who got lower shares of the vote to generally support her, putting her over the line, getting over 50% of the two-party vote after preferences. This sort of dramatic turnaround in such a safe seat would not have been thought possible just a few years ago. Generally speaking, if a candidate gets maybe 47-48% of the primary vote, and there's quite a few other minor and independent candidates, that will usually be enough for them to get over the line and win the seat. But if their primary vote drops a little bit more, like if it's say 40%, as we saw in the case of the Liberal candidate in Higgins, then winning is much harder. It all depends on the preferences for minor parties and independents. We are seeing results like that in many more seats, meaning that the election result will be more volatile than in the days where people generally either voted Liberal, National or Labor, with very few voting for third-party alternatives or independents. Could this happen in the Victorian state election? Well, we got a bit of a preview in 2018. Certain seats like Werribee and Melton had various local issues, resulting in Labor's primary vote being weak. Labor still won those seats, but had a big drop in its primary vote. And this in a state election that otherwise was favourable for the Labor Party, with Daniel Andrews' team winning an increased majority. Those Western seats in which there were the big swings were those that would have been considered safe for Labor before 2018. Going back to this year's federal election, there were also huge anti-Labor swings there, and they tended to be in some of Labor's safer seats. There are drops by as much as 15 to 20% in Labor's primary vote. And remember, this is in Victoria, which has become one of the stronger states for the Labor Party. And it was an election where the Labor Party won government after 9 years in opposition. The big swings were not enough to tip the Labor Party out, at least in Victorian seats, although there's a similar situation, but with candidate issues in New South Wales in the seat of Fowler, where the swing was enough to allow an independent to win. And remember, these are very traditional, rusted-on Labor seats that almost no one would think would be held by a candidate other than from the Labor Party. In some cases, the Liberal Party gained extra support, but in many others, it didn't, and the voters went to minor parties or independents instead. Time to go into a bit more detail. There's some big differences in the suburbs that had big swings and the others that had smaller swings against the Labor Party. I've been able to identify roughly 4 groups. What I call the big swingers established suburbs tend to be very multicultural, some of the lowest average incomes and labour force participation in Melbourne. A lot of the housing is 1960s to 1980s, quite a few renters and fewer kids than fringe areas. Some areas may have quite a large senior population who've been there for many years. The sort of suburbs I'm talking about might be Lalor, Thomastown, and the older parts of Deer Park. Also the likes of Noble Park and Hampton Park in the east. In the north, Heidelberg West really sticks out. What I call the big swingers fringe areas are a bit further out, growth areas like Tarneet, Clyde North, often very multicultural, especially in the west, north and parts of the outer southeast. These areas are likely to have significant mortgage commitments, more kids and higher labour force participation, generally a younger cohort. They might be very exposed to petrol costs. A lot of their jobs are in areas that there's basically no or very little public transport. And also they may be in insecure contract, casual type employment. So cost of living is likely to be a real issue for people in those seats. Yes, their incomes may be higher than people in the big swingers established areas, but their living costs are also more. Thirdly, we have the smaller swingers established. These are seats like Croydon, Boronia, Carrum Downs. Bit of a skew to the east and southeast. Again, housing mostly 1960s to 1980s. Those seats in the west and north swung a bit more, as did some in the east like Narre But overall, the smaller swingers, again, like your Croydons and Boronias, tend to be a bit less multicultural than the others. There might be quite a few people who came out from the UK in, say, the 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s. Probably have a higher median age, and a fair number would have paid off their homes. So cost of living for many households possibly a bit less of an issue than some of the areas I mentioned before. Fourthly, there's the smaller swingers fringe. Now, I didn't identify very many areas. These people might have swung against Labor only by, say, maybe 5% or so. but I would count a few booths around Doreen, Ironsbury. These are somewhat nicer, greener and less packed than other fringe areas. And I'm also guessing a low percentage of renters, so probably a little bit higher incomes there and a little bit less stress. Now there are some other areas that don't quite fit neatly in between the extremes, like Point Cook had anti-Labor swings of around 7%. It's very multicultural, but there's a bit higher incomes than some other outer suburbs and a bit more white collar. Altona and Niddrie are other but older suburbs that are also in between with regards to demographics, incomes and financial stress. So a bit of a continuum, but I think these four groups might be helpful in explaining some of the areas that had the big swings and some that had the smaller swings. If we zero in a bit more to, say, the southeast part of Melbourne, on the map now is the Route 800 bus. It starts at Chadstone Shopping Centre and goes pretty much straight down Princes Highway to Dandenong. And you'll notice that the anti-Labor swings, and these are actually drops in Labor Party's primary vote at the federal election, increase greatly the more you go out. As when you go past about Clayton, that's where the numbers really increase. For instance, Springvale Rise Primary School, 15% drop in Labor's primary vote. Harrisfield Primary School, 16% drop. Some big drops around Dandenong. These are in the seats of Hotham and Bruce. And you keep going further out, and then you follow another bus route, the 893, down Hallam Road, down towards Cranbourne. There's some big swings in Hampton Park, up to 19%. So some big anti-Labor swings in the southeastern suburbs. The people who voted at Harrisfield Primary School mostly live around here. Harrisfield Primary School's swing was so big, far bigger than for the seat of Hotham generally, that I thought it was worth visiting to take a look. These are the people who swung heavily away from Labor in the 2022 federal election. Their local state member is Dan Andrews. And yep, it's the Premier's election all right. Labor's primary vote in this area plunged by 16%, 4 times more than the overall seat. Average incomes are low, many people rent, and labour force participation, well, that's low as well. Right here on busy Princes Highway, the traffic whizzing past, and I'm at a bus stop. It's for Route 800, which is the only public transport in this area. The bus goes straight along the highway, Chadstone in one direction and Dandenong in the other, serving a lot of jobs and development along the way. Here's its timetable. Every 20 minutes on weekdays, not too bad. On weekends, well, it's a sad story. Only every hour on a Saturday morning, and Sunday afternoon it cuts down to every 2 hours, with the last bus before 5 p.m. There's nothing on Sundays. There used to be many more buses in the evenings, Saturdays and even on Sundays. But buses were massively cut back 30 years ago, and no government since, not any of the 13 transport ministers that have followed, have seen fit to restore the service. Despite Route 800 being a relatively productive and busy route. There's also the 811 on Heatherton Road to the south. Although there's areas near Noble Park Station within walking distance, there are some trips that the 811 is more convenient for. Although a main road service along Heatherton Road right here, it's just once an hour, even in peak times. Again, this has been unchanged for years. You can stand on a hill in Harrisfield and see the results of the government's transport infrastructure program. There have undoubtedly been benefits, both for car drivers on Heatherton Road and train passengers using the new Noble Park Station. Although things are slowly improving, almost completely overlooked has been the service aspect. Trains and trams, but especially buses. The areas not to have gained in the last 5 or 10 years are especially those seats that Labor has considered safe. It's even more noticeable when you look at booth-by-booth results. Booths that swung heavily against Labor, in some cases with their primary vote dropping by 15 or 20%, often have a high concentration of low incomes, social needs, and poor bus services. Harrisfield that I mentioned is just one example. Residential Campbellfield only has buses that run 5 or 5.5 days a week. That swung against Labor by 17%. Even bigger swings just over the other side of the Hume Freeway in places like Lalor and Thomastown. Their buses mostly run 7 days, but have big problems with not connecting with trains because of poor timetabling. And there's been no network review for many years, if not decades. There's big scope for a vastly simplified network for Altona North, while Altona Meadows, another big swinger of 15% against Labor, needs better weekend services and longer operating hours. There are similar swings over in the southeast around Hampton Park. Again, that needs a complete review of its bus services and definitely more service kilometres. The same can be said for many areas around Dandenong, Noble Park North and Springvale. Bus routes in these areas already have quite high patronage, but need service increases to boost their service to much more than once an hour, as is too often still the case. If you want better services in your area, whether it be transport or anything else, I think you can be cautiously optimistic in 2022. We've seen big political changes, as demonstrated by the 2022 federal election, meaning that parties can no longer take what they might think safe seats for granted. Instead, pretty much every seat is a marginal seat. Then we've also got some broader economic and other changes. Governments now have higher debt than they did 10 years ago, and interest rates are rising. It was previously very cheap to finance big infrastructure, but in conjunction with rising debts, higher interest rates, and increasing construction costs, it's going to be much harder and less attractive. This may not be a big spending election campaign, but what may be committed may lean more towards services, such as the improved buses that I've often talked about. 2022 could be finally the year that your safe seat gets a little bit of love. Let us all hope so.